start.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Folkerts, and thank you to Farrell in particular, and Michael and Louise. This is a wonderful opportunity tonight for you to see and to be with the people who saw the stories firsthand. They had the front row seat on this history, and I'd like to walk them through some of that history and talk about some of that. I think in some ways you may find that there are a number of similarities between the times that we're talking about and the times that we live in. And in some ways, when it's easy to think that nothing could be worse than the contentiousness that we're undergoing right now, it's sometimes interesting to see that things really were deeply troubled and more deeply troubled at a prior time. I want to just read one passage, if you don't mind, from a journalist who I think everyone here knew at one point or knew of, Hazel Brannon Smith, who was owner and editor of a paper up in Lexington, Mississippi. And in the 1950s, she took a moment to try to describe what life was like in Mississippi at that time. She was a white woman who was undergoing enormous pressure from the Citizens Council, not because she was an integrationist, as they accused her of being, but because she stood up for human dignity. In fact, I think she was late in calling for desegregation. I think she just said you can't go around the streets just because you have on a uniform indiscriminately beating people. And therefore, she was called a communist for that. So it's important to sort of go back in time and hear her voice and understand what life was like then. She wrote, "Today in much of Mississippi, we live in an atmosphere of fear. It hangs like a dark cloud over us, dominating almost every facet of public and private life. No one speaks freely anymore for fear of being misunderstood. Editors, preachers, teachers, and other professional people are affected by it, as well as business and industry. Almost every man and woman is afraid to try to do anything to promote goodwill and harmony between the races, afraid he or she will be taken as a mixer or worse." So try to put your mind in that time frame and in that atmosphere as we go through some of these questions. There's no doubt that through the book that reflects the enormous importance of the New York Times in this story. The New York Times from '64. Well into later years, from 58 to 64 under Claude Sitton, when he was the reporter, had enormous importance in digging out the story. And sometimes digging out the story just meant going to where nobody else was. Gene Roberts, my co-author, I had the privilege of working with him. He had been the New York Times correspondent in the South for a while. And Gene, I would like you to just reflect on what was the sort of the narrative arc of the Times, the New York Times involvement in the South from the first time when they set up operations here.
It's not generally appreciated, but from the mid-1930s until late 1968, the New York Times was run by a succession of Southerners. One from Virginia, who was succeeded by one from Mississippi, who was succeeded by Clifton Daniel from North Carolina. And they thought the South was a story, particularly Turner Catledge, the Mississippian. And he sent he was the first non-Southern newspaper editor to assign a reporter to the South permanently. He did it on the cheap. The Times family owned the paper in Chattanooga, so they set up the Times Southern Bureau in Chattanooga. The first reporter, Johnny Popham, viewed himself partially as a reporter, and he could be a good one when he decided to do that. But he also viewed himself as the Times ambassador to the South. And he cruised around the South, trading war stories with people he called his cousins. And if he had ever met you once, you were his cousin. He could be a brilliant reporter when he chose to do that. And when he covered the Emmett Till case in Mississippi, this was a turning point in how the American press began to discover the racial story. But it was not until 1957, after Johnny Popham had been in the South for 10 years, that the New York Times really picked up on the rhythm of the story. And it did it through Claude Sitton, who would later become editor of the Raleigh News and Observer. And Claude Sitton had a wire service background. He was geared to move fast on the story. He could have cared less about diplomacy and being an ambassador to any place. He was all about getting the story. And he was known for being almost the first person to appear on the first reporter to appear on the racial story. And for several years, it became a story almost because Claude Sitton was there. He was a lifeline to young students who decided to come south to participate in the civil rights movement. And readers of the New York Times would arm their civil rights children with Claude Sitton's name and phone number. And there were several cases in which young civil rights workers were in tight situations, and rather than calling the police, they called Claude Sitton. And Sitton responded quickly. He tried hard not to be partisan on the story, but would say later that, you know, when you, no matter how objective you tried to be, when you saw a black person being beaten for the simple reason that he was trying to exercise his voting rights, how could there be really two sides of this story? But to the best he could portray both sides, he did. And this is broad brushstrokes as the New York Times history on the story.
Just to go back on one point that I think Gene made, and I think it's important for everybody to understand, Claude Sitton was a reporter. He wasn't an editorial writer. He wasn't, you know, sort of trying to thrust his opinion onto the front pages of the New York Times. But the stories that he covered had such, he went to South Georgia once where he was covering some voting rights activity inside a church. The sheriff came in and was intimidating people and harassing them, including the reporters, and he wrote just a straight stenographic piece that was on the New York Times. You need to go back and read it, but I don't think you'll find an adverb or an adjective in that story. It was just a straight rendering of what happened. The New York Times put it on page 1. Attorney General Robert Kennedy sees it the next morning and immediately calls up the head of the Civil Rights Division, Burke Marshall, and says, get down to, I think it was Baker or Dougherty County in South Georgia or Dawson, anyway, get down there now. and bring intimidation and harassment charges against that sheriff. So sometimes just being there made the difference, and that's what distinguished Claude's reporting. Now, long before the New York Times was on the story, and long before anybody in the mainstream / white press was on the story, the black press was on the civil rights story. And they owned the story long before anybody else. And probably as much as anything in our book that Gene and I are probably proud of was the way we were able to explore that history. Moses Newson is a remarkable man, and I want you to know that you are looking at a man who was there at the Emmett Till trial as a reporter. He was at the Montgomery bus boycott with during the Rosa Parks episode. He was there in that's 1955, 1956, 1957. He's at Little Rock Central High. He's at the Freedom Rides. You saw that, and he barely got out with his life. He was on that bus, and he barely got out with his life, and he ended up leaving his camera on board and later retrieved it, right? Is that right? Yeah. I would like, Moses, if you would, to reflect on the unique role that the black press faced in the South. You were surrounded by mobs of angry white people who really would do anything to stop this, what they saw as this juggernaut. Just, if you would, talk about some of your experiences and the unique role that you had there.
Okay, I worked for 2 black newspapers. One was the Tri-State Defender in Memphis, and I spent 5 years there. And I went in 1957 to the Afro-American newspapers. We were crusading newspapers from the outset. Our mission was to try to do something about improving race relations in the country. And so we covered everything that we could. I came out of school in 1952 and went directly to the Tri-State Defender, which was one of the Chicago Defender newspapers. And I spent 5 years there, and among the stories I covered there was the Emmett Till case. That was a case where the 14-year-old kid was killed for whistling at a white woman. They say Whistle talked to her or something. I'm not sure exactly what the story turned out to be. But as soon as we heard that someone was in trouble for saying something to a white woman, I rushed down, shot some pictures in the little town. It was a small place. They only had 4 or 5 buildings there. And went out and talked to the uncle whose house the young man was visiting when they came to get him that night. It was a tense situation down there, and a lot of these places were pretty tense. In those days, you didn't travel the way you do now. There was no public accommodation bill, anything like that, so you couldn't call up the nearest Holiday Inn, and say, I'd like to have a room close to where the action is. You found some place to stay. You could call church people or NACP official or somebody who could give you a place to stay. On the Till trial, once we got there, we found out that the sheriff was working in cahoots with the people who had killed the boy. And so some of us went out and scurried around the area to try to find some witnesses to appear at the trial. I went out, as this was the only time I ever changed clothes when I went out on the story. Usually I wore what I wore in the office. This time we were going around these old plantations out there in the backwoods, so we changed clothes and sort of dressed the way the people dressed down there. It was kind of tough going back in those areas, but we had some people. One of the guys you probably know was Medgar Evers. He was driving the car when we were going around through the backwoods, and it was sort of tense building. Pretty tense business riding around back out there trying to find witnesses to testify against somebody who was never be convicted. And so it took the boy on the 28th of August. It took him out, beat him up, killed him. And nobody was ever convicted in that case. I was down there for the trial. I wasn't there every day because there were only two of us who were full-time editors at the Tri-State Defender. So one of us had to go between the paper, make deadlines in Chicago. After that case, it was in Hoxie, Arkansas, for the integration of the school there. I mention that because it was one of the first schools in the Deep South to integrate. It was a small place in West Arkansas, and it was the only time that the media was invited to ride the school buses and shoot pictures of the kids, go into the classrooms and talk to the teachers and shoot pictures of them together. That lasted for a while, and then people like John Casper and Asa Carter, people who went around trying to stir up trouble, they came in, and eventually they had trouble there. Clinton, Tennessee was a different situation because people had said where there were not a lot of black people, it would be pretty simple to integrate the schools. It's a little town, about 4,000 people, and only about 200 black people. And they all lived up on a hill called Foley Hill. And the kids had to walk down every morning on their way to school. People would line up on both sides of the streets to yell at them and throw stuff at them and that sort of thing. And I guess for some reason, different places you went, kids thought that being a press person, you could probably help them out, but that wasn't true. But at night there, people would come down from those hills in Tennessee, shooting off guns and firecrackers and that sort of thing. And it was a pretty tense place to work.
I would imagine that we've heard stories from some of the white reporters who covered the movement that they would seek they would, engage in protective, coloration. They would, as you said, they would dress as if they were the people, as if they were the white resistors, or they would sometimes dress in ways that made them look like FBI agents. For an African-American reporter, you couldn't very much pretend that you were an FBI agent, and you couldn't very much pretend you were part of the rabble-rousing White Citizens Council either.
Not likely.
Not likely, right. Are there any particular, and if you would just speak up a little louder, any particular harrowing moments that I mean, I know that there was one time when you very awkwardly had to sort of sidle up to a white reporter just because you thought that that the crowd was intimidating you.
Well, my first day in Little Rock was immediately after the governor had called out the National Guard to prevent school from being desegregated. And when I walked up to the area at the front of the school area, I was met by the colonel who was in charge, and told me I couldn't work up there because the very fact that I was up there could cause problems. And so they led me out, and a couple of guys would follow you down, to your car, that sort of thing, threatening you, calling your names and that sort of thing. And that was the time when I spotted a guy from the Commercial Appeal that I had seen around Memphis and went over to talk to him to get a little cover there. But a couple of days after that, we were walking up toward the school, and that's when the mobs on both sides were challenging us, calling us names, communists, the N-word, and all that sort of thing. And we were trying to show the credentials and all, and that didn't cut any mustard, of course. And eventually somebody said, the kids are getting into school, and that's when the mob took off on us, and they were beating us and kicking us and chasing around. And Alex Wilson, who had been my boss at Memphis before I left to go to the Tri-State Defender, go to the Afro-American, he'd had some trouble with the NAC, with the Ku Klux Klan down in Florida. And he had promised himself that he would never run from the KKK or anybody like that again. So a couple of us were sort of running along trying to stay ahead of the mob, and he didn't go, he didn't run, so they beat him up pretty bad. And he died a few years after that.
Yeah, there was a series of about 9 photographs taken of this day when Moses and L. Alex Wilson and 2 other journalists, black journalists, are walking towards Central High when the mob attacks them. And if you look closely at this 9 set of photographs, I think it's 9 photographs taken by Will Counts, you'll notice that it's obviously a very angry mob, and that one of the men is holding a brick, and they keep knocking L. Alex Wilson down, and he keeps getting back up and creasing his hat and putting it back on, and they keep knocking him down. He gets up, puts his hat. He never he was a very dour-looking man anyway, and people who knew him well, who friends of us, would never call him Alex. He was always L. Alex Wilson. And finally, at one point, somebody jumps on him with the brick. He kept getting up and walked away. His suit button coat never became unbuttoned, and he maintained his dignity. And as Moses says, he 3 years later, this is in 1957, 3 years later, he is ascended to the pinnacle of black journalism and become the editor of the Chicago Defender. But because, in large part, his wife believes, and I think there's fairly evident, because of injuries he suffered that day and neurological problems that he suffered that day, he died in 1960 at age 51. And I want to say that, you know, because it doesn't necessarily go without saying that Mr. Wilson, Mr. Newson, Jimmy Hicks, who was the other person there, I believe, with y'all that day, from the Amsterdam News in New York, they couldn't work in the white press at the time. Any of them were certainly capable of it. They would have been stars at any of the white newspapers, but even the white press wasn't hiring African Americans at that time. Thank you for that, and we'll come back. Can I just talk about Joe Cumming here for just a minute? Joe came from an old established family in Georgia, in Augusta. His great-great-great-great-grandfather, I can't remember how many greats there are, had delivered a eulogy for Robert E. Lee. That's how far back he goes. His family was as imbued with, if not the Confederacy, then all things Southern as anybody. He becomes a Newsweek correspondent based in Atlanta. And as I was going through some research on the Newsweek files, I find this letter that his father sent him on the letterhead of his father's law firm. I think it's Cumming, and Cumming. I'm not sure, you know, something like that. And his father was raising some questions about the loaded language that he thought Newsweek was using to describe the South, and was taking exception with it and said, you know, you would attract more readers with a little more honey in your stories and a little less vinegar. So Joe felt pressure even from his own family, and I say loving pressure, I'm sure, but to tell the story in a way that could be acceptable to the South. Joe, can you talk about that?
Truth is, and we're not self-conscious about that. We were striving for. The question's been asked about the race beat, of how did it come to be that the basic story, the most significant social story, social revolution in our country's history, and how is it that all male, white, Southern reporters were the basic thing, could be when editors, and The answer to that question is I got no idea. I never had any thought about that. When I was hired for Newsweek, the baseline, what do we call it? We call it default these days. The baseline, if you were going to be covering the story of the repression of human rights by Southern demagogues and in custom and in law, well, if you saw the injustice of that, then you're off and running. There's no problem. It's not either this or that. That was pretty plain, and I don't think we had any trouble. My parents, a little bit to the contrary of what you say, we were Roosevelt Democrats, and not what's that other conservative? That conservative. We didn't go along with whatever his name was. I can't remember. But anyway, I think that was true pretty much with all of us. If we didn't agree with our parents, we just kept quiet about it.
Sure.
And the challenge of people like Claude Sitton and Moses and all that is just to get a good story and get it right and make it readable.
But even open-minded progressive Southerners were often defensive about the portrayal of the South.
I don't remember that in the press corps I moved with. I do remember one time, actually, there was one guy from a paper that was a segregationist paper, and he stood out, and he asked these negative questions. And we asked negative questions, too, when they were appropriate. But that crowd that you've got in that book, I don't think they had any, and of course, you've got good history about that, too. Your father was a standout. I love the Hodding's background. Let's see, how does that go? They'd never had a Jewish member of the country club, and then no, what was that? He was going to get. He became member of the number one social club. Is that the way it worked? Anyway, that's.
But tell me then, Joe, what it would have been.
Did you want?
Go ahead. You want to reflect on
to talk about when Newsweek got excited about the story?
Yeah, let me just set that, if you don't mind. At the time, keep in mind, at the time in the early 50s and 60s, there were three major news weeklies that published in the U.S. There was Time magazine, by far the most dominant. Newsweek, that was coming on strong. There was U.S. News and World Report, which was ultra-conservative. And then you had your large format magazines, Time, Life, Look, Saturday Evening Post, those sorts of, and clearly the most dominant was Time magazine, but Joe was with Newsweek, and Newsweek had a different take on how to cover the South and the race issue. So why don't you take it from there?
Okay. I'd worked this. He told me he was going to ask a question about how Newsweek got on the story, so I'm.
Go ahead. That's where I'm leading you.
I was hired by Bill Emerson to come to work for Newsweek on Monday, January the 2nd, 1957. That was 10 days before that. There'd been the federal court had ruled a victory for the Rosa Parks that year of Martin Luther King leading the bus boycott in Montgomery. And the black leadership in Atlanta said, hey, we're off and running. Something's happening here. Let's have a mass meeting at Ebenezer Baptist Church tonight. And I had just gone to work, and I can't remember whether this was the first day. I think it was maybe in the week, a day or so. And Bill Emerson, who had hired me, said, you go cover that mass meeting. And I went down, and got to tell you, it was a few years later that I was asked to write about the civil rights movement. And here is my memory of that night.
Good.
The emotional highlight of the evening was the telling by one hero of, what they'd done. The black leadership had gotten on the bus, and instead of going to the back of the bus, as was the custom and the law, they put their penny in and they sat on the seats up front. You know, the buses, some of you remember those little sideways seats up front. And they were full of themselves that night. Oh, it was a night of glory because they'd been arrested and let out on bond. These were people like Reverend Borders and the distinguished people. And the emotional highlight of the evening was the telling by one hero of his experience of that day. You know those little sideways seats up front? Oh, yes, the crowd already floating began to jostle each other with excitement, nudging and laughing and knowing what was coming. Oh, yes, they knew those little seats. I I have always wondered what it would feel like to sit in one of those seats, shouted the speaker containing the gathering thunder with delight and holding off the delicious punchline to come. Well, today I sat down in one. The audience roared anew. And do you know how it feels? Shouts, laughter, applause lifted the moment to its finale. It felt good. And the sound of jubilation went out over the waves that night up and down Sweet Auburn Avenue.
That's nice.
So, first day, we were on to the civil rights story. It was a single story. It was stood by itself. They were not onto the big story. Let's see, the Little Rock. It was a big story, Little Rock. But that, again, was a federal judge, and Governor Forbes was trying to get reelected for the third term against custom, and so he had the demagogue against the federal government putting the children in school. You remember all that? Yeah, and so it still was not a really continuing story. Now, the sit-ins, they began to pay notice, and the next year, the 61, the Freedom Riders, that was a story. That bus was full of people, and I won't be the one to tell you who that is in the foreground, who they almost got burned up. And we went over, and then there were two buses that left Washington with integrated seating. It was a setup, it was a, what do you call, charter bus. And so this one was burned in Anniston, Alabama. The next one went on into Birmingham, where they got beat up, badly beat up there at the bus station. Everybody knew they were coming. Bull Connor, the commissioner, what was he called? Commissioner of
Theophilus Eugene Bull Connor.
And he said, and he had a little press conference and said, why didn't you have policemen there at the bus station? You knew they were coming. He said, well, it was Mother's Day, and I told them to go home and be with their moms. So by that time, Newsweek was really interested, and the editor of Newsweek then was Osborne Elliott, and he began to, give me one more. In Birmingham in '53. Running through the street, and King led a march of young people, and they got off and got to running up and down the street. Right at the time that Newsweek in the morning, this was a Monday, I guess it was, when they have their story conference with a speakerphone, and so I was on the telephone with them. And they said, what's going on there? And I said, here, come here. And there was a little young man, a little black man. And I said, tell my bosses what this is all about. And he said something like, it's about freedom. That's what this is about. Okay, thank you. And they got that's the first time they'd really had a first encounter with a black person. And from there, Oz Elliott came south and set up his own contacts with African Americans, and we had a ride there.
So much of the great journalism was just being there, and certainly if a New York Times reporter came down or a Newsweek reporter came down, they had an entire large institution behind them. New York Times was huge. Newsweek was huge. Then there were the small newspapers in the South that stood up for something. And there was no small newspaper that did it better and more persistently and at greater risk to itself than the Delta Democrat Times in Greenville, Mississippi. And this is where Hodding's father started it and made a name for it, largely on the editorial page, but also because there was a simple declaration that what black people do is news. And what happens to black people is news. And this was unusual in newspapering in the South at the time. You just didn't treat the black part of town or black people with the same equal judgment, journalistic judgment as you did white people. The Delta Democrat Times did that, which caused you a lot of grief, didn't it?
I was listening to these stories which overwhelmed me with memory, but what ought to overwhelm everybody is a starting point. The South won the Civil War. The South was allowed to operate for about 100 years as though it had not only literally won it, but on the field had won it. the North turned its back on the practices of the South and on white supremacy because the North, quite frankly, had never given a damn about that to begin with. And as a result, the notion that this is a white man's country to be forever preserved as white supremacy was endemic and unchallenged. And when it began to be challenged, the South understood that it had won before by total resistance physically, by total resistance economically, and the like. Great books have come out recently that I commend to you about what that meant, what redemption meant. But redemption lasted a long time. My family is as Southern as Joe's, which is to say white Southern. My great-grandfather was one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan, of which my grandfather's part of the family was inordinately proud. And white Southerners who were not proud of that kind of heritage kept their lips sealed. My father broke away by the hardest. And God, I do not know how he did it. I do not. But he did. And to read him now is to understand that what he broke to would be considered arch conservative today. It was the notion that the individual counted, but the institution could not be challenged at its essence. And he broke from that over time. But believe me, to suggest that you were not to treat the individual in any way as subhuman was considered to be alien, beyond suspect, and worthy of contempt. Dad won a Pulitzer for, in essence, saying we have to have racial tolerance. From then on, he was the red editor of Mississippi. I say all of this because what Dad did was an extraordinary break from the prevailing journalism, not just of Mississippi, which is, God knows, the South, but of the South generally. There was a handful of newspapers, and these guys have done this so brilliantly, I hate to do it, but there was a handful of papers in each state which, in one way or another, spoke with some clarity about what was going on. Our attempt to cover the story was, as my circulation manager used to say, a damn good way to kick circulation in the head. White folks did not wish to see anything about black folks on the front page except a lynching. That is not said to be cute. It is said to be a fact about the way journalism was practiced in much of the South, most of the South, most of the time. For a while, there was a belief that if you ignored the story, it would go away. And many newspapers did their duty in the South by simply not covering it. There was a belief if you beat the hell out of it with lies and a coverage which suggested it was a conspiracy hatched in Moscow, it would go away. And there were papers that did that with great persistence and whatever. One of the great things about my father was that his example, which made me someplace to stand when I came home in 1959, was such that it enticed a number of reporters, Southern and non-Southern, into that town, onto that newspaper, and out onto the story. And so these guys knew a lot of our reporters, saw them out there in the field. Forget the editorial policy. Covering the story was a hell of a break, being there. I did have one reporter who a number of you guys knew, who came to work for me for a summer and stayed for quite a while, named Foster Davis, and he got there in time for the Freedom Summer of '64. And he went over to a town where they had burned about 3 or 4 churches, and they were running freedom schools, and he came back and he was battered, bloody, coat off, ripped up, and he says, "So what happened?" And he said, "Well, they asked me who I was, one of them freedom riders, and I said, no, I'm a reporter," and that's when they beat the hell out of me. and he said, "Are we allowed to fight back?" And I said, "You not only can fight back, I'm sorry, we were not honest journalists, all right?" I said, "Most of us carry guns, all right? And it's okay, do it." Foster spent the rest of his time in Mississippi whipping the hell out of people on the travel back and loved every bit of it. I want to stop this and just say something. The people who did what they did ought to be read in the context of the time that they did it. To read it from today's perspective and to say, that doesn't sound like very much to me, is to ignore what it was that they were running against. And I want to repeat. Matter of fact, I called up Johnny Dore, who was the enforcer in the civil rights thing, the night that Ross Barnett gave a famous speech at a football game the night before Ole Miss went up in smoke. And I said, Johnny, you got to do something now. These people are going crazy. He said, don't worry, Hodding. We've made a deal with Ross. And I said, I don't give a damn what you think about a deal. These people think they're going to win Reconstruction a second time, and they're going to do it right here and right now. He said, no, it isn't going to happen. I say that because the next night, of course, they had to send in the troops. A few years younger, before that, a year before that, I'd gone up with a group of people from Mississippi to talk to Bobby Kennedy's people about what would happen when somebody went to Ole Miss. And to the last one of the whites said, oh, man, it'll be all right. Mississippians are going to respect the law. And I said, no, they're not. You're going to have to send in a minimum marshals and maybe more than that. And John Dore, it was 61. John Dore said to me, Hodding, not John Dore, John Siegenthaler, who was Bobby Kennedy's aide, said, Hodding, Mississippians are as loyal as any Americans. If you show the flag, it'll be all right. And Johnny, old Siegenthaler showed the flag at the time of the Freedom Ride, trying to save some woman from having the hell beat out of her. Next thing he knows, he's lying in the ditch with his head busted in by one of those flag-saluting Southerners that he was so certain would stand up for it. Again, I want to say something else. In that same year, I was in New York, and there was racial disturbances in Harlem. And the New York Times lead editorial begins, in recent years, the Negroes of Harlem have become increasingly unhappy with their situation, which is to say the obliviousness of the press generally to the story of race in this country did not begin in New Orleans, Louisiana. It began in some of the major cities and major newspapers of the country. And it was one of the great things about the initiative of those institutions covering the South, that it finally also forced them to cover their own situations, which was long overdue. And I was just long over my time. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's and by the way, we're going to leave some time for questions from the audience. So if you have some, be thinking of them. It cannot overstate how deeply people believed, even progressive, open-minded people believed that segregation would never end. Hodding's father had said it. Ralph McGill, the progressive editor of the Atlanta Constitution, had said it. Your own Jonathan Daniels here had said it. It would never end. People couldn't. It would be as if I were to say to you, your microwaves are unsafe. You can no longer use your microwave. And you wouldn't believe me. You would say it's impossible. I mean, that's a petty example. Or that night and day are changing. They're changing. It seemed impossible. But for every reporter who was out there, there came a moment when they knew that there was a possibility of change, and when they saw it. And Gene, I haven't told you I was going to ask you this, but I've heard. I would like you just to tell your story, if you would, about the church in Durham, White Rock Baptist.
I was working for the News and Observer in Raleigh in 1960 when the sit-in started in Greensboro and spread quickly to Raleigh and Durham. And the News and Observer and several of the large newspapers in North Carolina were some of the most progressive papers in the South. But there were no black voices in them. And if you read them, you would conclude that race was an argument between white people over whether a few blacks were going to be allowed in school, and then we would all go about our normal business, or whether no blacks at all were going to be allowed in schools or anything else. And it was almost as if black opinion did not exist. And you get caught up in that, surprisingly, and I sort of concluded that blacks were pretty much like the white view of them, that some obviously were standing up for their rights, but it became convenient for whites to believe that most blacks did not want change and were happy. And I got a view to the contrary because Martin Luther King decided to fly in and speak at the White Rock Baptist Church in Durham, maybe 8 or 10 days after the sit-ins had started. And I went over to cover it, thinking I would be covering essentially a civil rights rally of students with Martin Luther King exhorting them on. And I arrived at the church maybe 15 or 20 minutes early, and sure enough, there were lots of black students there, but they were all on the outside. And they were on the outside because they couldn't get on the inside. The older church members had arrived 1 and 2 hours early, and at the time I arrived, you couldn't squeeze your way into the church. And I was wondering how I was going to cover it. And the deacon of the church recognized I was a reporter and offered to boost me on his shoulders. It was sort of an unseasonably warm night in February of 1960, and he boosted me in the church window. And I sat there and covered things. And it was obvious that most of, there were certainly school teachers and even black college professors in the audience. But it was clear that most of the people in the audience were the stalwarts of the church. That is, black maids and laundresses, because they were basically the only jobs, unless you were a school teacher, that blacks could hold, even in a relatively progressive southern state like North Carolina. And at one point, Martin Luther King was his usual spellbinding self, and it was clear the audience was totally with him. And then when contributions were asked for the civil rights movement, black women, black maids and laundresses, money was so tight that as a custom, rather than let their change rattle around loose in their pocketbooks, they would put it in their handkerchiefs and knot the handkerchiefs 2, 3, and 4 times to make sure they didn't lose a nickel or a dime. And when they were asked for contributions, you could see all over the church auditorium, hands go down, pick up the pocketbook, put it in their laps, and slowly everybody was unknotting the knots and put in nickels, dimes, and quarters and the collection plate. At that time, I was probably 29 years old, and up until that night, I had not thought I was going to see racial change in the South. And after that night, I was convinced we were going to have change and we were going to get it massively, because I had seen how deep the sentiment ran in the black community. And it would be possible to be a white Southerner, even a fairly sophisticated white Southerner, and not know that that type of sentiment existed.
You know, I need to say something about that because it reminds me. In fact, evolution took place on two different lines. And one was the understanding that real change was coming. But I'll be honest with you, I grew up in a house in which it was clear from all the conversation that it was going to come. I mean, that I never doubted it for a moment, that the whole effect from post-War II on was going to be it. The only question was it ever going to come to Mississippi? I mean, and that's not as big a joke as it sounds like. I mean, that was the one, when, oh God, when, you know, will that happen? I mean, for what you encountered over there at Sumner and those first stories was the face of what was going to be going on in Mississippi right through the 60s.
Did you, Moses, when did you feel, did you ever have this moment where you thought, okay, it's finally going to happen, or did you have to wait for that moment of legislative passage in 64 or again in 65?
Well, I suppose the Supreme Court ruling on school desegregation suggested that things were going to change. After Little Rock, when President Eisenhower called out the troops to enforce the court's rulings, that was a major happening. As a matter of fact, you know, there were quite a few white people who were on the line trying to help bring about change. I look at this picture here on the Freedom Ride thing, the bus burning. The 13 original people were 7 black and 6 whites. And, you know, the further we went in the South, the meaner people got against the white people who were participating. And it was a sort of a thing that Carter was mentioning a while ago, that white people in the South didn't care what the court said. They were going to do what they wanted to do. There had been 3 separate rulings saying that black people could sit wherever they wanted on buses, but they decided that wasn't going to happen. And that Mother's Day, when we were in Anniston, Alabama,
that's where the
police standing around, but people were breaking out windows.
Threatening people, and eventually they threw a bomb in the bus right behind the seat where I was.
Why don't you tell us, give us a couple of minutes on that scene, and then I'll come back to you, Joe. Just give us that scene. I know you were sitting next to Simeon Booker, I believe. Is that right, or near that?
It happened that day. I was on the Greyhound bus, and Simeon was on the Trailway. Okay. We saw us from time to time. Martin Luther King had been in Atlanta pro-life group, and he had told us that KKK and some policemen had decided that you would not get through Alabama alive. And when we got to Anniston, Alabama, that's when things started going bad. These were regularly scheduled buses. Some people didn't know what was going on. In fact, we had breaking out the windows and trying to get onto the bus to get to us. There was this black woman on the bus who was down on her knees, you know, crying, I don't want to die like this, and why are you doing this thing to us like this? Now, she wasn't freedom runner, she was just someone else. But my experience out there was kind of a dangerous situation, because the white policemen were part of the people who were opposing desegregation. You never knew when they were going to help you or and they were going to join the crowd. And some of them were joining the crowd that day. But once the bus was set on fire, I sort of decided I was going to be the last person off. And, you know, I was covered for miles with handkerchiefs and that sort of thing. People were jumping out of windows and police and gatherings in those days. And eventually, white policeman, his name was Carroll Hall. We didn't know he was on the bus, but he was one of two state policemen who were on the bus. And he pulled out his pistol and slid in the floor and prevented the mob people from getting onto the bus. Hadn't been for that, we might have not have made it at all. I was shooting pictures along the way, and one of the things that was very keen about the police was people shooting pictures. So I had taken the camera and stuck it in front of the seat where I was sitting, planning to get it later. But the bus burned up pretty quickly, and I didn't get a chance to get the camera off the bus. But I wrote the Greyhound, and they found the camera, and they got it back to me. And if you're ever in Washington at the museum where they have all the materials, the camera is on view over there.
What's the film? That's good.
Film, I lost all the film.
Yeah.
The camera was pretty beat up.